The Colour of Magic by Terry Pratchett. The podcast versions of the original Facebook live readings by Matthew Ogden, the Bearded Wit. Please bear in mind, as usual, that these are live recordings, so there are the odd fluff here and there, the odd stumble, and quite often laughter, as the reader appreciates the humour along with you, the listener. Don't forget to like, share, and make sure that absolutely everybody you know that might like this is aware of these recordings. Thanks very much. Before we start, I'd really appreciate it if you could take some time to go over to patreon.com/thebeardedwit and sign up to become a patron. You can do that from as little as $5 a month, which is the price for a good cup of coffee, or even a bad cup of coffee some places. But it does mean that with that support I'm able to keep doing this stuff, and this is exclusively funded by the support that I get through Patreon. Also, if you're listening to this on Spotify or on Apple or on Google podcasts, wherever you are, please do give me a follow and a like. And if you do, if you're not listening on Spotify but you have access to Apple and other things like that, please go over to those podcast things and give me a like and a follow and a rating, because that's going to help so much with the organic growth of the podcast. So if you could do those things for me, that would be fabulous. Oh, also, you could go over to YouTube and find me there as well and do the same. Basically do all those groovy things. All right, enough of that, Matthew. Calm down. On with the podcast. Thanks a lot, everyone. Part 8. Quick recap. Okay, so we are in The Colour of Magic, Terry Pratchett, and we have got to a point where Twoflower has actually turned into the hero. Rincewind was supposed to be the hero, but actually, he was being forced to be so by Kring, if we're quite honest. And Kring was basically getting Rincewind into situations he could not, didn't have the capacity, the abilities to deal with, and as such was falling to what seemed like a pretty awful doom, and instead he managed to be saved at the last minute by Twoflower. But how did that happen? Well, it turns out that because Twoflower has this fantastic imagination, and that they are in a part of the Discworld, and let's face it, they're in an upside-down mountain, that is absolutely crackling with magic, it turns out he's pretty darn good at manifesting dragons. And he was flying on his dragon. What was his dragon called again? Oh, we'll get to that in a minute. But he was flying on the dragon, and he managed to catch the falling Rincewind before he splattered himself onto the guano-covered floor in the bottom of the central chamber in the Wormberg. That's where we got to. Let us carry on and see where else we get. Thank you so much for joining me. You're all fabulous. I will still do live readings as well, but this is also, as I say, I want to try and get even more of this content out there, and I need to find a way of doing that. So some of this stuff will be live, sometimes it won't, if this works. If it doesn't work, back to square one. So, Rincewind, caught, dragon, Twoflower, awesome, good job. We carry on. At noon, in a wide green meadow on the lush tableland that was the top of the impossibly balanced Wormberg, the dragons and their riders formed a wide circle. There was a room beyond them for a rabble of servants and slaves and others who scratched a living here on the roof of the world, and they were all watching the figures clustered in the centre of the grassy arena. The group contained a number of senior dragon lords, and among them were Liort and his brother Laertes. The former was still rubbing his legs with small grimaces of pain. Slightly to one side stood Liessa and Hrun, with some of the women's own followers. Between the two factions stood the Wormberg's hereditary lawmaster. "As you know," he said uncertainly, "the Nod fully late Lord of the Wormberg, Gregor I, has stipulated that there will be no succession until one of his children feels himself, or as it might be, herself, powerful enough to challenge and defeat his or her siblings in mortal combat. Yes, we all know all of that. Get on with it, said a thin, peevish voice from the air beside him. The Lawmaster swallowed. He had never come to terms with his former master's failure to expire properly. Is the old buzzard dead, or isn't he? He wondered. It is not certain, he quavered, whether it is allowable to issue a challenge by proxy. It is, snapped Grieker's disembodied voice. It shows intelligence. Don't take all day about it. I challenge you, said Hrun, glaring at the brothers. Both at once. Liort and Laertes exchanged looks. You'll fight us both together? Said Laertes, a tall, wiry man with long black hair. Yeah. That's pretty uneven odds, isn't it? Yeah. I outnumber you 1-2. Liort scowled. You arrogant barbarian. That just about does it, growled Hrun. Oh! The Lawmaster put out a blue-veined hand to restrain him. It is forbidden to fight on the killing ground, he said, and paused while he considered the sense of this. Yeah. You know what I mean, anyway, he hazarded, giving up, and added, as the challenge parties, my lords, Liort and Laertes have choice of weapons. Dragons, they said together. Liesa snorted. Dragons can be used offensively, therefore they are weapons, said Liort firmly. If you disagree, we can fight over it. Yeah, said his brother, nodding at Hrun. The Lawmaster felt a ghostly figure prod him in the chest. Don't stand there with your mouth open, said Grieker's graveyard voice. Just hurry up, will you? Hrun stepped back, shaking his head. Oh no, he said. Once was enough. I'd rather be dead than fight on one of those things. Die then, said the Lawmaster, as kindly as he could manage. Liort and Laertes were already striding back across the turf to where the servants stood waiting with their mounts. Hrun turned to Liesa. She shrugged. Don't I even get a sword? He pleaded. A knife, even? No, she said. I didn't expect this. She suddenly looked smaller, all defiance gone. I'm sorry. You're sorry? Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I thought you said you were sorry. Don't glare at me like that. I can imagine you the finest dragon to ride. No. The Lawmaster wiped his nose on a handkerchief, held the little silken square aloft for a moment, and then let it fall. A boom of wings made Hrun spin around. Liort's dragon was already airborne and circling towards them. As it swooped low over the turf, a billow of flame shot from its mouth, scoring a black streak across the grass that rushed towards Hrun. At the last minute, he, Hrun, pushed Liesa aside. Hold on, I'm going to sneeze. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that, folks. This may as well be live. I'm not going to edit this out. Sorry. Try that again. Hrun. At the last minute, he pushed Liesa aside and felt the wild pain of the flame on his arm as he dived for safety. As he rolled, he hit the ground and flipped onto his feet again whilst he looked around frantically for the other dragon. It came in from one side, and Hrun was forced to take a badly judged standing jump to escape the flame. The dragon's tail whipped around as it passed and caught him a stinging blow across the forehead. He pushed himself upright, shaking his head to make the wheeling stars go away. His blistered back screamed pain at him. Liort came in for a second run, but slower this time to allow for the big man's unexpected agility. As the ground drifted up, he saw the barbarian standing stock still, chest heaving, arms hanging loosely by his sides. An easy target. As his dragon swooped away, Liort turned his head, expecting to see a dreadfully big cinder. There was nothing there. Puzzled, Liort turned back. Hrun, heaving himself over the dragon's shoulder scales with one hand and beating out his flaming hair with the other, presented himself to his view. Liort's hand flew to his dagger, but pain had sharpened Hrun's normally excellent reflexes to needle point. A backhand blow hammered into the Dragon Lord's wrist, sending the dragon arcing away towards the ground, and another caught the man full on the chin. The dragon, carrying the weight of 2 men, was only a few yards above the grass. This turned out to be fortunate, because at the moment Liort lost consciousness, the dragon winked out of existence. Liesa hurried across the grass and helped Hrun stagger to his feet. He blinked at her. "What happened? What happened?" he said thickly. "That was really fantastic," she said. "The way you turned that somersault in mid-air and everything." "Yeah, but what happened?" "It's rather difficult to explain." Hrun peered up at the sky. Laertes, by far the more cautious of the 2 brothers, was circling high above them. "Well, you've got about 10 seconds to try," he said. "The dragons?" "Yeah." "They're imaginary." "Like all these imaginary burns on my arm, you mean?" "Yes." "No," she shook her head violently. I'll have to tell you later." "Fine, if you can find a really good medium," snapped Hrun. He stared up at Laertes, who was beginning to descend in wide sweeps. "Just listen, will you? Unless my brother is conscious, his dragon can't exist. It's got no pathway through to this." "Run!" shouted Hrun. He threw her away from him and flung himself flat on the ground as Laertes' dragon thundered by, leaving another smoking scar across the turf. While the creature sought height for another sweep, Hrun scrambled to his feet and set off at a dead run for the woods at the edge of the arena. They were sparse, little more than a wide and overgrown hedge, but at least no dragon would be able to fly through them. He didn't try. Laertes brought his mount into land on the turf a few yards away and dismounted casually. The dragon folded its wings and poked its head in among the greenery, while its master leaned against a tree and whistled tunelessly. "I can burn you out," said Laertes after a while. The bushes remained motionless. "Perhaps you're in that holly bush over there." The holly bush became a waxy ball of flame. "I'm sure I can see movement in those ferns." The ferns became mere skeletons of white ash. You're only prolonging it, barbarian. Why not give in now? I burned lots of people. It doesn't hurt a bit, said Laertes, looking sideways at the bushes. The dragon continued through the spinney, incinerating every likely-looking bush and clump of ferns. Laertes drew his sword and waited. Hrun dropped from a tree and landed running. Behind him, the dragon roared and crashed through the bushes as it tried to turn around, but Hrun was running with his fixed gaze on Laertes and a dead branch in his hands. It is a little-known but true fact that a two-legged creature can usually beat a four-legged creature over a short distance, simply because of the time it takes for the quadruped to get its legs sorted out. Hrun heard the scrabble of claws behind him and then an ominous thump. The dragon had half opened its wings and was trying to fly. As Hrun bore down on the Dragon Lord, Laertes' sword came up and wickedly to be caught on the branch. Then Hrun cannoned into him, and the two men sprawled on the ground. The dragon roared. Laertes screamed as Hrun brought a knee upwards with anatomical precision, but managed a wild blow that re-broke the barbarian's nose for him. Hrun kicked away and scrambled to his feet to find himself looking up into the wild horse face of the dragon, its nostrils distended. He lashed out with a foot and caught Laertes, who was trying to stand up on the side of his head. The man slumped. The dragon vanished. The ball of fire that was billowing towards Hrun faded until, when it reached him, it was no more than a puff of warm air. Then there was no sound at all, but the crackle of burning bushes. Hrun slung the unconscious Dragon Lord over his shoulder and set off at a trot back to the arena. Halfway there, he found Liort sprawled on the ground, one leg bent. Try that again, shall we? Halfway there, he found Liort sprawled on the ground, one leg bent awkwardly. He stooped and, with a grunt, hoisted the man onto his vacant shoulder. Liesa and the lawmaster were waiting on a raised dais at the end of the meadow. The dragon woman had quite recovered her composure now, and looked levelly at Hrun as he threw the two men down on the steps before her. The people around her were standing in deferential poses, like a court. "Kill them," she said. "I kill in my own time," he said. "In any case, killing unconscious people isn't right." "I can't think of a more opportune time," said the lawmaster. Liesa snorted. "Then I shall banish them," she said. "Once they are beyond the reach of the Wormberg's magic, then they'll have no power. They'll be simply brigands. Will that satisfy you?" "Yes." I am surprised that you are so merciful, but..." Hrun shrugged. "A man in my position, he can't afford to be anything else. He's got to consider his image." He looked around. "Where's the next test, then?" "I warn you that it is perilous. If you wish, you may leave now. If you pass the test, however, you will become Lord of the Wormberg, and of course my lawful husband." Hrun met her gaze. He thought about his life to date. It suddenly seemed to him to have been full of long, damp nights, sleeping under the stars, desperate fights with trolls, city guards, countless bandits, evil priests, and on at least 3 occasions actual demigods. And for what? Well, for quite a lot of treasure, he had to admit, but where had it all gone? Rescuing beleaguered maidens had a certain passing reward, but most of the time he finished up by setting them up in some city somewhere with a handsome dowry, because after a while even the most agreeable ex-maiden became possessive and had scant sympathy for his efforts to rescue her sister sufferers. In short, life had really left him with little more than a reputation and a network of scars. Being a lord might be fun. Hrun grinned. With a base like this, all these dragons and a good bunch of fighting men, a man could really be a contender. Besides, the wench was not uncomely. The 3rd test? Oh, sorry, he didn't say that. She did. The 3rd test, she said. Am I to be weaponless again? Said Hrun. Liessa reached up, removed her helmet, letting the coils of red hair tumble out. Then she unfastened the brooch of her robe. Underneath, she was naked. As Hrun's gaze swept over her, his mind began to operate 2 notional counting machines. One assessed the gold in her bangles, the tiger rubies that ornamented her toe rings, and the diamond spangle that adorned her navel, and 2 highly individual whirligigs of silver filigree. The other was plugged straight into his libido. Both produced tallies that pleased him mightily. She raised a hand and proffered a glass of wine. She smiled and said, I think not. He didn't attempt to rescue you, Rincewind pointed out as a last reward. He clung desperately to Twoflower's waist as the dragon circled slowly, tilting the world at a dangerous angle. The new knowledge that the scaly back he was astride only existed as a sort of 3-dimensional daydream did not, as soon as he'd realised, do anything at all for his ankle-wrenching sensations of vertigo. His mind kept straying towards the possible results of Twoflower losing his concentration. Not even Hrun could have prevailed against those crossbows, said Twoflower stoutly. As the dragon rose higher above the patch of woodland where the 3 of them had slept a damp and uneasy sleep, the sun rose over the edge of the disk. Instantly the gloomy blues and greys of pre-dawn were transformed into a bright bronze river that flowed across the world, flaring into gold where it struck ice or water or a light dam. Owing to the density of the magic field surrounding the disk, light itself moved at subsonic speeds. This interesting property was well utilised by the Sorka people of the Great Neff, for example, who over the centuries have constructed intricate and delicate dams and valleys, walled with polished silica, to catch the slow sunlight and sort of store it. The scintillating reservoirs of the Neff, overflowing after several weeks of uninterrupted sunlight, were a truly magnificent sight from the air, and it is therefore unfortunate that Twoflower and Rincewind did not happen to glance in that direction. In front of them, the billion-ton impossibility that was the magic-wrought Wormberg hung against the sky, and that was not too bad, until Rincewind turned his head and saw the mountain's shadow slowly unroll itself across the cloudscape of the world. "What can you see?" said Twoflower to the dragon. I see fighting on the top of the mountain, came the gentle reply. See, said Twoflower, Hrun's probably fighting for his life at this very moment. Rincewind was silent. After a moment, Twoflower looked around. The wizard was staring intently at nothing at all, his lips moving soundlessly. Rincewind? The wizard made a small croaking noise. I'm sorry, said Twoflower. What did you say? All the way. The great fall, muttered Rincewind. His eyes focused, looked puzzled for a moment, and then widened in terror. He made the mistake of looking down. Ah! He opined, and began to slide. Twoflower grabbed him. What's the matter? Rincewind tried shutting his eyes, but there were no eyelids to his imagination, and it was staring widely. Don't you get scared of heights? He managed to say. Twoflower looked down at the tiny landscape mottled with cloud shadows. The thought of fear hadn't actually occurred to him. No, he said. Why should I? You're just as dead if you fall from 40 feet as you are from 4,000 fathoms. That's all I say. Rincewind tried to consider this dispassionately, but couldn't see the logic of it. It wasn't the actual falling, it was the hitting Twoflower grabbed him quickly. Steady on, he said cheerfully. We're nearly there. I wish I was back in the city, moaned Rincewind. I wish I was back on the ground. I wonder if dragons can fly all the way to the stars, mused Twoflower. Now that would be something. You're mad, said Rincewind flatly. There was no reply from the tourist, and when the wizard craned around, he was horrified to see Twoflower looking up at the paling stars with an odd smile on his face. Don't you even think about it, added Rincewind menacingly. The man you seek is talking to the dragon woman, said the dragon. Said Twoflower, still gazing at the paling stars. What? Said Rincewind urgently. Oh, yes, Hrun, said Twoflower. I hope we're in time. Dive now! Go low, go low! Rincewind opened his eyes as the wind increased to a whistling gale. Perhaps they were blown open. The wind certainly made them impossible to shut. The flat summit of the Wormberg rose up at them, lurched alarmingly, then somersaulted into a green blur that flashed by on either side. Tiny woods and fields blurred into a rushing patchwork. A brief silvery flash in the landscape may have been the little river that overflowed into the air at the plateau's rim. Rincewind tried to force the memory out of his mind, but it was rather enjoying itself there, terrorising the other occupants and kicking over the furniture. I think not, said Liessa. Hrun took the wine cup slowly. He grinned like a pumpkin. Around the arena, the dragons started to bay. Their riders looked up, and something like a green blur flashed across the arena, and Hrun had gone. The wine cup hung momentarily in the air, and then crashed down on the steps. Only then did a single drop spill. This was because, in the instant of enfolding Hrun gently in his claws, 9 Reeds the dragon had momentarily synchronized their bodily rhythms. Since the dimension of the imagination is much more complex than those of time and space, which are very junior dimensions indeed, the effect of this was to instantly transform a stationary and priapic Hrun into a Hrun moving sideways at 80 miles an hour, with no ill effects whatsoever, except for a few wasted mouthfuls of wine. Another effect was to cause Liesa to scream with rage and summon her dragon. As the gold beast materialized in front of her, she leapt astride it, still naked, and snatched a crossbow from one of the guards. Then she was airborne, while all the other dragon riders swarmed towards their own beasts. The lawmaster, watching from the pillar he had prudently slid behind in the mad scramble, happened at that moment to catch the cross-dimensional echoes of a theory being at the same time instant hatched in the mind of an early psychiatrist in an adjacent universe, possibly because of the dimension leak was flowing both ways, and for a moment the psychiatrist saw the girl on the dragon. The lawmaster smiled. "Want to bet that she won't catch him," said Grisha in a voice of worms and sepulchres right by his ear. The lawmaster shut his eyes and swallowed hard. "I thought that my lord would now be residing in the fully dead, dread land," he managed. "I am a wizard," said Grisha. "Death himself must claim a wizard, and he doesn't appear to be in the neighbourhood." "Shall we go?" asked Death. He was on a white horse, a horse of flesh and blood, but red of eye and fiery of nostril, and he stretched out a bony hand and took Grisha's soul out of the air, rolled it up until it was a point of painful light, and then he swallowed it. Then he clapped spurs to his steed, and it sprang into the air, sparks coruscating from its hooves. "Lord Grisha," whispered the old lawmaster, as the universe flickered around him. "That was a mean trick," came the wizard's voice, a mere speck of sound, disappearing into the infinite black dimensions. "My lord, what is death like?" called the old man tremulously. "When I have investigated it fully, I will let you know," came the faintest of modulations on the breeze. "Yes," murmured the lawmaster. A thought struck him. "During daylight, please," he added. "You clowns!" screamed Hrun from his perch on Ninereed's foreclaws. "What did he say?" roared Rincewind as the dragon ripped its way through the air in the race for the heights. "Didn't hear!" bellowed Twoflower, his voice torn away by the gale. As the dragon banked slightly, he looked down at the little toy spinning top that was the mighty Wormberg and saw the swarm of creatures rising in pursuit. Ninereed's wings pounded and flicked the air away contemptuously. Thinner air, too. Twoflower's ear popped for the third time. Ahead of the swarm, he noticed, was a golden dragon. Someone on it, too. "Hey, are you all right?" said Rincewind, urgently. He'd had to drink in several lungfuls of the strangely distilled air in order to get the words out. "I could have been a lord, and you clowns had to go and..." Hrun gasped as the chill, thin air drew life even out of his mighty chest. "What's happening to the air?" muttered Rincewind. Blue lights appeared in front of his eyes. "Unk," said Twoflower, and passed out. The dragon vanished. For a few seconds the three men continued upwards, Twoflower and the wizard presenting an odd picture as they sat one in front of the other with their legs astride something that just wasn't there. Then what passed for gravity on the disc recovered from the surprise and claimed them. At that moment Liessa's dragon flashed by, and Hrun landed heavily across its neck. Liessa leaned over and kissed him. This detail was lost to Rincewind as he dropped away with his arms still clasped around Twoflower's waist. The disc was a little round map pinned against the sky. It didn't appear to be moving, but Rincewind knew that it was. The whole world was coming towards him like a giant custard pie. Wake up!" he shouted above the roar of the wind. Dragons! Think of dragons!" There was a flurry of wings as they plummeted through the host of pursuing creatures, which fell away and up. Dragons screamed and wheeled across the sky. No answer came from Twoflower. Rincewind's robe whipped around him, but he did not wake. "Dragons!" thought Rincewind in a panic. He tried to concentrate his mind, tried to envisage a really lifelike dragon. If he can do it, he thought, then so can I. But nothing happened. The disc was bigger now. A cloud-swirled circle rising gently underneath them. Rincewind tried again, screwing up his eyes and straining every nerve in his body. A dragon! His imagination, a somewhat battered and overused organ, reached out for a dragon. Any dragon. "It won't work," laughed a voice like the dull tolling of a funereal bell. "You don't believe in them." Rincewind looked at the terrible mounted apparition grinning at him, and his mind bolted in terror. There was a brilliant flash. There was utter darkness. There was a soft floor under Rincewind's feet, a pink light around him, and the sudden shocked cries of many people. He looked around wildly. He was standing in some kind of tunnel, which was mostly filled with seats in which outlandishly dressed people had been strapped. They were all shouting at him. "Wake up! Wake up!" he hissed. "Help me!" Dragging the still unconscious tourist with him, he backed away from the mob until his free hand found an oddly shaped door handle. He twisted it, ducked through, and then slammed it hard. He stared around the new room in which he found himself and met the terrified gaze of a young woman who had dropped the tray she was holding and screamed. It sounded like the sort of scream that brings muscular help. Rincewind, awash with fear-distilled adrenaline, turned and barged past her. There were more seats here, and the people in them ducked as he dragged Twoflower urgently along the central gangway. Beyond the rows of seats were little windows. Beyond the windows, against a background of fleecy clouds, was a dragon's wing. It was silver. I've been eaten by a dragon, he thought. That's ridiculous, he replied. You can't see out of dragons. Then his shoulder hit the door at the far end of the tunnel, and he followed it through into a cone-shaped room that was even stranger than the tunnel. It was full of tiny glittering lights. Among the lights, in contoured chairs, were 4 men who were now staring at him, open-mouthed. As he stared back, he saw their gazes dart sideways. Rincewind turned slowly. Beside him was a 5th man, youngish, bearded, as swarthy as the nomad folk of the great Neff. Where am I? Said the wizard. In the belly of a dragon? The young man crouched back and shoved a small black box in the wizard's face. The men in the chairs ducked down. What is it? Said Rincewind. A picture box? He reached out and took it, a movement which appeared to surprise the swarthy man, who shouted and tried to snatch it back. There was another shout, this time from one of the men in the chairs. Only now he wasn't sitting, he was standing up, pointing something small and metallic at the young man. It had an amazing effect. The man crouched back with his hands in the air. "Please give me the bomb, sir," said the man with the metallic thing. "Carefully, please." This thing? You can have it. I don't want it," said Rincewind. The man took it very carefully and put it on the floor. The seated men relaxed, and one of them started speaking urgently to the wall. The wizard watched him in amazement. "Don't move," snapped the man with the metal. An amulet, Rincewind decided. It must be an amulet. The swarthy man backed into the corner. "That was a very brave thing you did," said amulet holder to Rincewind. "You know that?" "What?" "What's the matter with your friend?" "Friend?" Rincewind looked down at Twoflower, who was still slumbering peacefully. That was no surprise. What was really surprising, however, was that Twoflower was wearing new clothes. Strange clothes. His breeches now ended just above his knees. Above that he wore some sort of vest of brightly striped material. On his head was a ridiculous little straw hat with a feather in it. An awkward feeling around the leg regions made Rincewind look down. His clothes had changed too. Instead of the comfortable old robe so marvellously well adapted for speed into action in all possible contingencies, his legs were encased in cloth tubes. He was wearing a jacket of the same grey material. Until now he'd never heard the language the man with the amulet was using. It was uncouth and vaguely hublandish. So why could he understand every word? Let's see. They'd suddenly appeared in this dragon after they'd materialized in this dragon. They had struck up a conversation in the airport so naturally they'd chosen to sit together on the plane, and he'd promised to show Jack Zweibloomen around when they got back to the States. Yes, that was it. And then Jack had been taken ill, and he'd panicked and come through here and surprised this hijacker, of course. What on earth was hublandish? Dr. Rincewind rubbed his forehead. What he could do with was a drink. Ripples of paradox spread out across the sea of causality. Possibly the most important point that would have come to be borne in mind by anyone outside the sum totality of the multiverse was that although the wizard and the tourist had indeed only recently appeared in an aircraft in midair, they had also at one and the same time been riding on that aeroplane in the normal course of things. That is to say, while it was true that they had just appeared in this particular set of dimensions, it was also true that they had been living in them all along. It is at this point that normal language usually gives up and goes and has a stiff drink. The point is that several quintillion atoms had just materialized, however they had not, see below, in a universe where they should not strictly have been. The usual upshot of this sort of thing is a vast explosion, but since universes are fairly resilient things, this particular universe had saved itself by instantaneously unravelling its space-time continuum back to a point where the surplus atoms could be safely accommodated, and then rapidly rewinding back to that circle of firelight, for which, for want of a better term, its inhabitants are wont to call the present. This had, of course, changed history. There had been a few less wars, a few extra dinosaurs, and so on. But on the whole, the episode passed remarkably quietly. Outside of this particular universe, however, the repercussions of the sudden double take bounced to and fro across the face of the sum of things, bending whole dimensions and sinking galaxies without a trace. All this, however, was totally lost on Dr. Rincewind, 33, a bachelor born in Sweden, raised in New Jersey, and a specialist in the breakaway oxidation phenomena of certain nuclear reactors. Anyway, he probably wouldn't have believed any of it. Zweiblümen still seemed to be unconscious. The stewardess who'd helped Rincewind to his seat, or Rincewand to his seat, to the applause of the rest of the passengers, was bending over him anxiously. "We radioed ahead," she told Rincewand. "There'll be an ambulance waiting when we land. It says on the passenger list that you're a doctor." I don't know what's wrong with him," said Rincewand hurriedly. "It might be a different matter if it was a Magnox reactor, of course. Is it shock of some kind?" I've never... Her sentence terminated in a tremendous crash from the rear of the plane. Several passengers screamed. A sudden gale of air swept every loose magazine and newspaper into a screaming whirlwind that twisted madly down the aisle. Something else was coming up the aisle. Something big, oblong, and wooden, and bound in brass. It had hundreds of legs. If it was what it seemed, a walking chest of the kind that appeared in pirate stories brimful of ill-gotten gold and jewels, then what would have been its lid? What? Say it again. If it was what it seemed, then what would have been its lid suddenly gaped open. There were no jewels, but there were lots of big square teeth, white as sycamore, and a pulsating tongue red as mahogany. An ancient suitcase was coming to eat him. Rincewand clutched at the unconscious Zweiblümen for what little comfort there was there, and gibbered. He wished fervently that he was somewhere else. There was a sudden darkness. There was a brilliant flash. The sudden departure of several quintillion atoms from a universe that they had no right to be in anyway caused a wild imbalance in the harmony of the sum totality, which it tried frantically to retrieve, wiping out a number of sub-realities in the process. Huge surges of raw magic boiled uncontrolled around the very foundations of the multiverse itself, welling up through every crevice into hitherto peaceful dimensions and causing novas, supernovas, stellar collisions, wild flights of geese and drowning of imaginary continents. Worlds as far away as the other end of time experience brilliant sunsets of coruscating octarine as highly charged magical particles roared through the atmosphere. In the cometary halo around the fabled ice system of Zeret, a noble comet died as a prince flamed across the sky. All this was, however, lost on Rincewind, as, clutching the inert Twoflower around the waist, he plunged towards the disk's sea, several hundred feet below. Not even the convulsions of all the dimensions could break the iron law of the conservation of energy. And Rincewind's brief journey in the plane had sufficed to carry him several hundred miles horizontally and several thousand feet vertically. The word plane flamed and died in Rincewind's mind. Was that a ship down there? The cold waters of the Circle's sea roared up at him and sucked him down into their green, suffocating embrace. A moment later, there was another splash, as the luggage, still bearing a label carrying the powerful travelling rune TWA, also hit the sea. Later on, they used it as a raft. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we will leave it for this evening. Thank you, as always, so much for joining me. It's a great pleasure to read for you. I really, really do enjoy this stuff. We'll see if the experiment works with this pre-record and see where we go from there. We will have a read again, same time, same place, next week. Don't forget, if you've got a chance, go over to patreon.com/thebeardedwit and sign up to become a patron from as little as $5, €5 a month to support me in the making of all this content. If you can go, if you can, wherever you're listening to this, if you can like, share, follow, go to my YouTube channel, follow me there as well, follow me on Facebook, wherever. If you can do that in all these places, it will help with the organic spread of what I'm doing. Thank you so much for this evening. Look after yourselves. And I will see you soon. See you guys. Bye.